Good evening, everyone. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'd like to thank you all, first of all, for coming this evening to listen to our guest speaker, Professor James Russell of Harvard University. Before I introduce Professor Russell, I'd like to call your attention to a flyer that's being handed out, which is about our next event, which is about remembering the Armenians of Bitlis. Many of you here are from Baresh, and this should be an interesting exhibit that we're putting on along with Ara Sarafian of the Gomidas Institute. There will be an opening reception on Sunday, March 30th at 3 p.m. And then at the Henry Madden Library. And then we'll also have a lecture by Mr. Sarafian down and about Bitlis, an exhibition on Bitlis Armenians on the shores of Lake Van. And so he will be talking about the exhibition as well. And so we invite you all to attend that. For this evening's lecture, I'd also like to thank NASR, the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research, and my collegian for co-sponsoring this event. NASR in Watertown, Belmont. In Belmont, Massachusetts, works in close coordination with the Mashtot's chair at Harvard University. They've put on many great events together since James has been there for the past 2 decades. And we're always happy to have them co-sponsor our events. They're a great resource for Armenian studies in general, and so whenever they can get involved with programs here in Fresno, we're very happy. I'd also like to thank the Knights of Vartan, as it's thanks to them that we have refreshments this evening after the lecture, so we also invite you all, as usual, to enjoy the desserts that are being presented by the Knights of Vartan after the lecture. Our speaker tonight, Professor James Russell, needs, I think, little introduction, considering that he was here 3 years ago as well. Many of you, I think, looking out in the audience, probably heard him then when he spoke about the poetry of Mezzarens. We are also very pleased to say that the press at Fresno State is working together with Professor Russell in publishing his translations and commentaries on the poetry of Mezzarens, and we look forward to seeing that in the future. And we're enjoying the opportunity to work together with him on that. Professor James Russell is the Mesrop Mashtot's Professor of Armenian Studies at Harvard University. He is a specialist in many fields. I can't even begin to list them because it would take up all of our time. So I will say that he has, however, been focusing his attentions more recently on modern Western Armenian poetry and literature, and modern Armenian literature in general. Although he has an extensive background in classical and medieval Armenian as well, his recent focus has been on the literature of modern Armenian. And tonight he will, many of you are probably familiar with his translation of Bedros Durian called Bosphorus Nights. That was an excellent publication put out in 2005. I know we use it in teaching Armenian 148 here. It's an excellent translation and commentary on those poems of Bedros Durian. But tonight he's going to go off on a slightly different tack, and he will be talking about the Futurist poetry of Kara Darvish, an Armenian poet from Tiflis, whom some of you may be familiar with, but many people probably are not. He's sort of an undiscovered treasure and a literary eccentric. So we look forward to a tantalizing and fascinating lecture tonight on the Futurist poetry and the literary eccentric Kara Darvish by Professor James Russell. James.
Thank you, Sergio. I would like to express my own thanks to Professor Laporta and to Professor Dermagurchian for their unbelievable hospitality and kindness. This time, as well as last time I was in Fresno, I'm having a wonderful time here. And to my host, Larry Balakian, again, who has opened his home to me with storied hospitality. So I'm deeply grateful to be here and very happy too. And also, I'm glad to present this initial preliminary material from my research to one of the most thriving Armenian communities left in the world. The last time I was here was in 2011. At that time, there was an Armenian community with many publishing houses, schools, libraries, all manner of cultural resources that was 1,000 years old and many thousands strong that now doesn't exist. I speak of Aleppo, Syria. Yeah? So we are in a disastrous state, really. And part of the reason I have shifted my attention from Armenian antiquity and some degree from the national epic and from medieval matters to modern Western Armenian literature is because UNESCO has declared Western Armenian an endangered language. Languages are perishing at the same rate as species. Just as various plants and animals in the Amazon basin and elsewhere are vanishing, so are human languages. There are about 5,000 now. By the end of the 21st century, fewer than 1,000 may be left. And each time a language disappears, we lose not only a unique expression of human identity, but also the accumulated wisdom and tradition of that language, local knowledge, herbal cures, recipes, stories, everything. Yes? I'm determined that Western Armenian will not suffer that fate, despite everything that's happening. And that is why I changed my own tack in research to modern Armenian literature very decisively. This is only actually a small diversion because I'm going to be speaking about an Eastern Armenian writer this evening, but nonetheless there are interesting connections to what was going on at the same time in Western Armenian literature and life, and I will address those briefly. It may be a fairly long lecture. I beg your indulgence if anyone has to answer a call of nature or has something else to do. I won't be offended if you leave, but I'll try to leave room for discussion and questions afterwards. An Armenian poet calling himself Kara Darvish. This is a Turkish word and a Persian word. Kara in Turkish means black. Darvish is a Persian word meaning literally a poor man, Arabic faqir. And this was a title that Sufi mystics who wandered around with begging bowls, who sang love songs to God and played music and got drunk and scandalized the Muslim establishment, called themselves dervishes. Not just spinning, they did many things all over the Muslim world. And the name dervish, although it's a Muslim name, is not that unusual for Armenians. Arshak Chobanyan, the great educator and writer who lived in Paris, also called himself dervish in some of his writings. He used the same nom de plume. So an Armenian poet calling himself this worked in the Georgian capital Tiflis, now Tbilisi, during the tumultuous years of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, events that destroyed much of the world and transformed much of the rest. But he felt he was living in times to come. He called himself a futurist. And as a futurist artist, he hoped to go back to the roots of the Armenian language, to its earliest beginnings, to recreate it, to make new sounds, new visual patterns even, new ways of writing Armenian, and of making art, and to create poems that a different kind of man than the man of the present, one who was freer, healthier, more honest, less constrained by tradition, was to speak and write and paint. He consciously lived several centuries in the future, or so he thought. The Futurists, a movement which originated in Italy and France and spread very quickly to the Russian Empire, experimented with syllables and typefaces and the direction and orientation of texts. They wrote up and down and around, and their paintings and sculptures attempted to depict not still lives, not an object, but an object in motion. They felt that since the world moved, portray it moving, not static. Part of their aim was not so much to change what we see and hear, but to break the chains of conventional art and literature in order better to express and depict what is really there. Because very often, conventional language and conventional art prevent us from seeing what's in front of us. We merely paste onto reality what we expect to see. Words are not monotonous, linear phenomena that crawl in straight lines across a page. There are different sounds all around and above and below us, with different accents and different pitches. Language is musical. Reality is musical. The mind isn't just conventional thinking, but also the irrational, the subconscious. So why not express it? Why not write in different directions, with letters of different sizes, using not just the words that are part of everyday speech, but nonsense words. Words that evoke feelings, but don't have a particular meaning, or magic spells. The sounds of dreams, childhood, of nature, and above all of machines, of modernity, of life as it really existed at the turn of the 20th century, when many Armenians were living in cities, and electricity and telephones were coming into use, things of that kind. Airplanes were taking people into the sky for the first time. Radios were conveying speech invisibly across vast distances at speed. Why should art and literature crawl slowly on the ground? Kara Darvish was born Hagop Genjian in the North Caucasus, married to a Russian woman, and most of his fellow futurists at the cafe he frequented. In those days, artists went to cafes, they didn't stay at home mostly, were Russians. But he was just as much part of the Armenian literary world. He was a friend of the novelist Kostan Zaryan, an unrecognized genius in many ways, and I'm translating now a large chunk of his novel, Nava Lejandra, the Ship Upon the Mountain, which deals with the Futurists of Tiflis. And he was also a friend of the young revolutionary poet Yevishet Charents, who came in and out of Tiflis, who was born in Kars. He was an eccentric. He dressed oddly, behaved scandalously, detested all forms of inequality, liked to drink, and believed in free love. He was very proud of the Armenian nation and its ancient culture, and wrote about it. But he also proclaimed himself the brother of all men, and a citizen of the world. He called himself a cosmopolitan. And Tiflis was a cosmopolitan city. His poetic manifestos echo the people whom his contemporaries read. From America, Walt Whitman in particular, and to a lesser extent, William Blake. But they also foreshadow a future that really was to come that he was not to see. Because as we'll see when we look at some of his poems, the poetry of the American beat poet, who spent a good part of his life not far from here in San Francisco, Allen Ginsberg, was kin to Kara Darvish. Kara Darvish is noteworthy in the larger study of futurism for another particular quality we don't find in any other writer. He was consciously a man of the Near East. He was perhaps the only Near Eastern futurist who addressed his criticism not only to mainstream bourgeois culture in general, but to the particular tendency of Near Easterners, Armenians, Iranians, Georgians, Azeris, and others, to denigrate their own culture and to imitate everything Western. He thought that this was a form of self-denial and an inferiority complex, and he was one of the first people to write about it in an articulate way. And by focusing on this as a cultural phenomenon, he anticipated by a century studies of what has come to be called Orientalism. So he and Charents in the decade following his eclipse were the heralds of an authentic and authentically Armenian counterculture. Until the early decades of the 20th century, Armenians were and had been for centuries a stateless people. As a Christian minority in a Muslim sea, they were barred from the traditional social positions that secured power and security, land ownership, the military, and government. In the coastal cities of Turkey in particular, Armenians gained wealth and prominence through trade, industry, and communication. All of these skills demanding a cosmopolitan outlook and a receptivity to progress and change. In the Russian Empire, the position of the Armenians was physically considerably more secure, but they were still not members of the dominant nationality. The official policy of the Tsars was Russification. The Armenian church was not considered Orthodox, and to a great extent the same cosmopolitan model therefore applied, and applied more and more as urbanization grew and Armenians moved to the major cities. So this is perhaps one reason why an eccentric Armenian, rather than a Turk or an Arab or a Persian, might try to see beyond his ethnic boundaries, seeking political and social equality in a hoped-for and imagined new world where those limitations would no longer matter. So that's why, for example, it was an Armenian from Smyrna named Bedros Tengerian who invented the only international language ever invented in the Near East. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, roughly 500 international languages were invented in Europe and America. The one that has survived is called Esperanto. That's the most widely known. In the Middle East, none, except for this one, called Satlerai, which was invented by an Armenian from Smyrna, who had lived in Constantinople and studied with the Mechitarists in Vienna. I have a whole separate spiel on him, and if you want a copy of my article, I can provide it to Professor Laporta. But suffice it to say, it took an Armenian to do that. I'm not talking about self-pride and Armenians first. What I'm saying is that the position of the Armenians was unique. And this is part of the reason why we have an eccentric like Bedros Tengerian inventing this language, or this futurist poet, the only one to use a Near Eastern language and mold it in the futurist manner. It's indicative of the very precariousness of the situation of the Armenians, however, that neither Setlerai, the Armenian Esperanto of Bedros Tenger, nor the futurist language and poetry of Kara Darvish found any receptivity in the lands of their birth and survived. Indeed, neither is even remembered by any but a very few specialists. In the wake of the 1915 genocide, in the West, the formation of the Soviet Union in 1922 in the East, and the imposition of the official dogma of socialist realism there, about a decade later, Armenians became subject to restraints beyond their control and were of necessity preoccupied with vital concerns of the here and now, not the imagined tomorrow. A minority culture, a diaspora culture, Armenia had to cling to its strong foundations as one might to a rock in a stormy sea. An established church, a canonical literature of traditional forms expressing accepted morals. Yeah? This was a matter of survival. But Kara Darvish and his comrades contributed vitally to futurism and its kindred movements, nourished by it. Cubism, surrealism, Dada, in fact, did not disappear. They gained strength wherever life permitted and were a vital motive force in the growth of the movements that shaped the world in which we now live, the cultural, philosophical, and even scientific change of the 20th century that championed human liberation and created much of what is good in the future in which we now survive. So they are part of an inheritance that covers the whole world. And part of this study bringing Kara Darvish's work into English is to affirm that he was ultimately not alone. But for literary scholarship, which requires that one probe the sources of a work as part of understanding its meaning, even a movement with the name Futurism still has to have a past. Yeah? And it begins with a different war, a different revolution, a different young, rebellious, eccentric genius, and a different country. This poet sounded the themes of changed consciousness and depiction of reality, the transformation of language, universalism, the magic of words. And like so many of the good things in life, he was French. In 1911 to 14, the Nouvelle Revue Française published the letters of a poet, Arthur Rimbaud. Rimbaud had sought to transform the world through his poems, which he began writing as a teenager, and he gave it up at 21 when he thought he had not actually changed the world. But in fact, he created modern poetry. His visions led to all the transformations that he had hoped for, in fact, of all the arts, and Futurism, Surrealism, and subsequent cultural movements, the Beats and their successors, everything basically from Picasso to punk rock, can be traced to him. He came to the French capital in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War and the fall of the revolutionary Paris Commune. It seems to be convulsions of this kind that sometimes give birth to creativity. And I suppose his poetic manifesto is his Lettre de Voyant, Letter of a Seer, dated 15 May 1871, of which I will quote just a few bits. I say that one must be a seer. One must make oneself a seer. A poet becomes a seer, one who sees, through a long, immense, and reasoned derangement of all the senses, all shapes of love, suffering, madness. He searches himself, he exhausts all poisons in himself, and he goes on. Yeah? Then what is his task? To find a language. Moreover, speech being thought, the time for a universal language will come. Only an academician, deader than a fossil, I can attest to that from where I work, could complete a dictionary in any tongue. In other words, language exists as it's spoken. It's a live thing. You can't put it in a book. Yeah? Weak people who might begin to think about the first letter of the alphabet, they would soon jump into madness. This language will be soul for the soul, summing up everything. Perfume, sounds, colors, thought, hooking thought and pulling. The poet would define the amount of unknown awakening in his time in universal thought, and so on. The future will be filled with number and harmony, and so on. Meanwhile, let us ask novelty from the poet, concludes Rimbaud, ideas and shapes. So the challenge to innovation, derangement of the senses, love, progress, a new art, and a completely new kind of language had been flung down. So who is this Habab Genjian? Who answered the challenge? Well, he was born at Stavropol in the North Caucasus in the Russian Empire in 1872. He entered the Armenian seminary at Nornapichevan. This is a community established by Catherine the Great in the Russian city of Rostov-on-the-Don, but he left in 1893 without taking holy orders. Then he taught at the Kevorkian College in Echmiadzin and adopted the pen name Kara Darvish with the publication of a fairly standard romantic poem called Lejan Astvatzuhin, the goddess of the mountain, in the very standard gray Tiflis journal Meshag, the Cultivator, number 205, 1909. Meshag was the New York Times of the Caucasus. You know, it was the paper of record. It pretended to be liberal. It pretended to be innovative. In fact, all it did was support the establishment, the art of the establishment, the same faces, the same names. You want to throw it across the room. Anyway, this was, yeah. And he worked as a journalist, settling in Tiflis in 1910 for Meshag, Surhantak, another paper, Express Messenger, and Geizer Sparks, which wasn't throwing off any sparks. He had a Russian wife named Olga, and she and he translated and offered for sale recent and avant-garde Russian literary works in Armenian translation. I have a list of them all, and their prices, and where to get them, because you could apply directly to his home, but the market proved disappointing. And he also translated into Russian the works of Armenian writers, such as Avedi Saharonyan and Levon Shand, and the important dramatist Shirvanzadeh. This is a standard literary trajectory for the time. Lots and lots of biographies of Eastern Armenian writers are like this. Yeah? But the difference is he had already begun innovative experiments in writing and was already being criticized for them. In 1911, he was attacked for what the critics perceived as his misuse of Armenian. Anything new was always seen as ungrammatical, a mistake, in his novel Yervan Gosh, and he replied thus: "It is my conviction that every new writer, if he is entering the literary arena with a calling, must bring new literary forms with him. He's not to masticate and employ only that which the generations before him masticated and used." We should recall at this point that at the other pole of the Armenian world, Constantinople, the writer and poet Tiran Cherakian, Intra he called himself, an anagram of his first name, had also published an innovative novel in which he transformed the Armenian language called Nerashkar, the inner world, full of neologisms and experiments, and had weathered exactly the same sort of school-marmy criticism, replying with a similar kind of defiance. Futurism had begun in 1909, really, with the publication of the Manifesto by an Italian named Marinetti, and the movement spread very quickly to Russia, where in January 1913, the Russian Futurists published, with a typically provocative name, "Пощёчина общественному вкусу," a slap in the face to public taste. Yeah? And in the summer of that year, local Futurists painted their faces, which was not considered acceptable, and paraded through St. Petersburg and Moscow to scandalize the public. Marinetti himself lectured in Moscow in 1913, tactfully avoiding his usual abuses of Tolstoy, whom Russians generally venerated and who had died only 4 years earlier. Marinetti was very different from the Russian Futurists. First of all, Kara Darvish and the other Russian Futurists really loved women. Marinetti hated them. He said they waste man's time. He said that people should be reproduced by machine. I'm not sure whether he was serious about this. He also said that war is the best thing for human beings because it kind of gets them out of their chairs. Again, people who've actually experienced it were not so interested in having wars. The Russians were not interested in wars. They were interested in universal brotherhood. But Italy was kind of on the side of things in those days, and so Marinetti thought that he said at one point, the worst thing a young man can do is spend a day in the library. Yeah? He should be out fighting and developing his muscles and all of this sort of terrible. But he didn't say any of this in Moscow. He stuck to speaking about innovations in art and language, and Kara Darvish reported on all of the visit and explained what Futurism was about, and at the same time supported it in a manifesto called What is Futurism, published the same year, which I'm translating into English. The translation's almost finished. Let's see if I can find it. That's not it. That's not it. We'll get there. And, no, there. Incantations, Kara Darvish. Yeah. This copy is from Nasser, by the way. Widener at Harvard doesn't have it. I don't know of a library that has it. It's bound in a miscellany. It's very interesting. One of the leaders of the movement, the Futurist movement in Russia, was a poet and scholar named Vladimir Khlyebnikov, who claims Armenian blood in a short autobiography that he wrote. Now, all of the Futurists were great mystifiers and fantasists, and it's possible Khlyebnikov was part Armenian. He also says that he had ancestors who were Mongolians running across the steppe, so who knows? But the point is he was aware of Armenians. They weren't an obscure people in the Russian Empire. Yeah? And he endowed the followers of the movement in Russia with the more Slavic name Buditvyanya, which means sort of like what will be-ers. And he had studied Sanskrit and other Eastern languages in Petersburg. And in collaboration with a scholar named Roman Jakobson, who later on became the head of Slavic and linguistics at Harvard, he devised something called Zaum, which means trans-rational language. That is to say, language which you hear and it sounds like it ought to mean something, but it doesn't, but you want to keep listening to it, which was composed of folk spells, sectarian incantations, glossolalia, which is what Pentecostalists do when they begin speaking in tongues, and secret code languages, argos, as well as street sounds and pure nonsense syllables and experiments with vowels. This derangement that Rambo had called for, this particular kind of derangement of linear canonical language was accompanied by innovations in typography and graphic design as well. Why write just in one line left to right, using letters all the same size, when you can change them around? Yes? Life doesn't go like this. It goes other ways. Yes? And the Futurist movement also coincided with the Cubism of Picasso and Braque, and with the calligramme of Apollinaire. And the latter's poems were placed on the page precisely in order to echo their subject as images, as drawings that were also poems. So this was a revolution in poetry, in art, and language. I want to give you an example of what, which we'll get to presently, of what the Armenian version of this was like. There. Okay, this is one of Kara Darvish's poems, and on the left you see a typically cubist composition attempting to show bodies and shapes in motion. And it says Sigismund Waliszewski, this was a Tiflis Polish artist. Kara Darvish podnosit stikhi se G. Melnikovej. Tush meaning watercolor, 1919. Kara Darvish is offering his poems to Sofia Melnikova. Sofia Melnikova was a femme fatale and dancer who frequented a place I'll get to called the Fantastichesky Kavachok, the fantastic little bar in Tiflis, where they all used to hang out together, and in 1919 they collected a bunch of poems in Russian and Georgian and then Kara Darvish in Armenian to present to her. Yeah? Okay, so this is what we're dealing with here. Yeah? And as you can see, some of the words are Armenian, some sound like they ought to be Armenian, but they're not, and some are just sounds. Yes? Kara Darvish adopted Zaum to Armenian. He used native sources and references and the urban sounds of Tiflis itself, invoking musical instruments. His poems play with different typefaces, sizes, and orientations of letters, inviting the reader to see them as pictures, and the reciter to attempt a rendition in perhaps song, I don't know, like do, do, well, creak, something like that, you little demon. That's the first line. And then Zaran Zar, look, Muri. Zaran Zar doesn't mean anything. Murik could be from a rhyme from a folk song, meaning wandering and begging. Zar means gold in Iranian. Zar here, which would be pronounced in Western, Tsar, yeah? That means the hair of a horse's mane or its tail. And this is, well, I'll get into this more, but if you'll permit me, this is where Kara Darvish is using Armenian spells. I've been trying to do an analysis of how he uses Armenian magical texts. Many Armenian spells invoke the hair of the mane of the horse of Surp Sarkis, or Surp Kevor, or Surp Theodoros. These are the three mounted saints who spear devils. Yes? So, and the word for that is tsash, horsehair, the thick sort of horsehair that like you use for a violin. Yeah? Yeah, and he uses that a lot. We'll see what else he uses. presently. Anyway, so his poems are self-described incantations. He calls them horut ulunk, citing Moses Horonatzi, that is to say, spells and beads. This refers to the legend of Ara and Shamira. Yes. Well, that's good. And in Tiflis at the time, one other thing I wanted to mention is that there was a fairly rich environment here of all sorts of people you could hang out with and talk not only about art, but about mysticism, new forms of religion, new forms of death. This is a map called the Ferro-Concrete Poem, Tiflis. Железо бетонная poema. Poema means a big epic poem in Russian. Tiflis by Vasily Kamensky, who was one of the Futurists. And people have written a lot about this poem. You know, that's Mount Matatsminda there. And then there are various different bars where they hung out, and the circus. And then here, and then it says the post office, and then Tolpa, the crowd. Tolpa. Well, so what? What does this have to do with Armenians? Why did you come this evening, right? I'll tell you. Then he lists who lived in Tiflis. Gruzia, Georgia. Salami Artvepe. Salami is just an Arabic word meaning hello. Artvepe we don't know the meaning of. He must have heard something, but my cart philologist friends can't figure it out. Persia, Iran. A Choban Koyun. Oh shepherd, where are your sheep? Russia, Russia. Sari Nakitku. All you guys get to the head of the prow of the boat. It's what, on the Volga there used to be bandits in boats, and that's what they would always say. When they were about to attack someone, they would say, everybody to the prow, you know, to start shooting. And then Armenia, Erjankutun. Do I need to translate it?
Yeah.
Erjankutun means happiness. Yeah, so that's what you could count on Armenians and Tiflis for. The Russians were bandits, the Persians were looking for lost sheep, the Georgians, who knows, but Armenian, you get what you want. Yeah. So, okay. So, and one of the people who you could find somewhere in this map was a very curious fellow from Alexandropol named George Gorgiev. Gorgiev, whose name means Georgian, claims in his autobiography that his father was an ashul who used to sing in Armenian. An ashul is a bard. And that he once went to Ani and found in a sealed cave manuscripts half in Armenian, half in a language he didn't know, but he deciphered them. It's kind of like in your book that you made up. And that, and he may have made this up too, that belonged to the Sarmung Brotherhood, and were the secret teachings of the Imastuns, he said. Imastun. Wise, yes. So Gorgiev, who was perhaps a Greek, yeah, but grew up in Armenia, knew Armenian perfectly, and he had his school of mysticism and dance in Tiflis before the whole thing folded when communism took over, and they moved to Paris, yeah? So Kara Darvish knew him, yeah? The Moscow Futurists actually visited Tiflis in 1914, and some were to return and stay. And so he wrote his Manifesto. And the Manifesto is interesting not just for reporting on what Marinetti had said, but also because he has some very critical things to say about the Armenian literary establishment. He singles out for particular ridicule and assault a poet named Hovhannes Tumania. Yes, who was the grand old man of Armenian letters, universally loved. I hate people like that. We have one in Boston, Longfellow, an appalling poet, and, you know, and a folk hero. I hate that man. And, you know, it's the sort of thing that just smothers. I don't like it, sorry. If you like Longfellow, it's okay, but Tumanyan didn't mean to repress new movements in Armenian art. But on the other hand, he had created a kind of canonical language which was accepted and which more or less excluded from the mainstream anything that didn't agree with it, and he ran a literary establishment. Mind you, Kara Darvish did this partly to annoy people, to scandalize them, to stir them up. Yeah? Normally people would hear about Tumanyan and fall back asleep again, but if you say, Hovhannes Tumanyan, who represses the arts, what a scoundrel, people will wake up and start thinking about literature. That helps. Yeah? So he attacked him. If you're not satisfied with that, the other villain of the piece is Sayat Nova. He says, why the hell do we have to constantly hear Sayat Nova? Isn't there any new kind of music that we can play? Yeah? He says, I'm so sick of the neinim, neinim, neinim. You know, the la 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 of Ashok music. Because it was supposed to be something of the people. And mind you, Stalin was going to say, yes, Sayat Nova's great, Tumanyan's great, because they were so conventional. Yeah. And for the classicists in the audience, the other people he attacks are Movses Khorenatsi and Agathangelos. Why should we spend so much time, says Kara Darvish, publishing this garbage from the 1500 years old, when other people who are writing new books are starving and can't find a publisher? Now, mind you, he uses Movses Khorenatsi, the Patmahar, the father of history of Armenia, himself. He uses this stuff, his precious mythological material, in his own poems, but that doesn't stop him from attacking him, because they didn't have to be consistent. Yeah? The other thing I want to say is that the critical editions we still use of both Movses Khorenatsi and Agathangelos were published in Tiflis and in precisely those years. These are great monuments of Armenian scholarship. I'm not talking about money wasted on trivial books. So Kara Darvish got some attention by saying this, shall we say. Yeah? And so he was attacked. For example, Karakin Levonyan, the great scholar of Armenian Ashuk poetry, said that these were trivial and offensive remarks, and he excoriated the activity of the Futurists as Oyin bazutun kerarvesti tacharum, tomfoolery in the temple of fine art, and charlatanutun, charlatanry, and chantage, blackmail. Yeah, well, this is Russian Armenian. Yeah, yeah, and this was in the journal Gerharvest, Fine Art. So, Kara Darvish wrote his first great futurist poem called Sheresh Blur, meaning the Hill of Asphodel Flowers, in 1914. Yeah, very, very interesting, and I'll get back to it. But he was also a novelist. He wrote a novel in 1917 called Gyanki Chutaka, The Violin of Life, which is about how this guy who goes home from work every night and just has dinner suddenly notices a beautiful Russian woman in another room playing a guitar, and for the first time in 2 weeks he brushes his teeth, he combs his hair, and then he has a love affair with her. It was very shocking, but nobody read it because look at the year, 1917. People had other things on their minds. Yes? Poor Kara Darvish. But the main thing that had happened in that year was the Russian Revolution. He welcomed it, since he was far away from it, thinking it was to lead humanity to dock at a Siro Navahankist, a safe haven of love. Yes? And in a lecture called Prologue, he wrote, a great energy is acting, a great forward push is emerging, and the new man, the man of the great force of thought and struggle is being born. I side with the conviction that futurism is advancing and expanding among oppressed peoples, be that oppression moral or economic. Now, Georgia did not join this love fest of liberation. At first, the Georgians broke away. They became a Menshevik republic, and a great many Russians who also found Lenin's Red Terror somewhat less than desirable fled to Georgia. Yeah. These were futurists, artists of all sorts, members of the nobility, and they formed the fantastic little tavern where they recited their poems, showed their paintings, people would come and go. And a typical poem that Kara Darvish recited on 14 May 1921 there was, "Who is the hero?" Who's the hero? He declared, "The hero is the one who shatters human law and tramples it underfoot, who converses with the stars and champions their law, who goes out into the street naked and crazy and outside the crowd, treading underfoot the clothing of law and order men have worn for 1,000 years. The anarchic, lawless madman." That's the hero. This is what's so there. Now, there's something of Nietzsche in this, but so what? What's much more striking and poignant to me is a particular verse. Goes out into the street naked, crazy, outside the crowd. Where have we heard that? Not before, but since. Here, a poem called Howl. "I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night." This is Allen Ginsberg. This is what changed America in 1956 and got us out of the rut of McCarthyism, eating casseroles, all those things. Yes? And look who anticipated it. Do you see? If only it had been heard before. Part of the tragedy of Armenian culture is that these things get said, but nobody hears them because they vanish. We bring them back. So, Kara Darvish had a conception of futurism that, as I said, is interesting because of the way he presents a critique we don't often hear of mainstream Armenian culture, but also because he speaks about the culture of the Near East in general and how it has been suppressed by the wealthy and the powerful who want to modernize, who want to be more like the West. Yeah? So, for example, he says that why do we always listen to, I don't know, Mozart or other stuff from the West when actual people are listening to Arshin Malalan? Does anyone know Arshin Malalan? Everyone knows it. That's wonderful. Because guess what? Yeah? The sheet music was even published in Astoria, New York. Yeah, in the 20s. Arshin Malalan is a Tatar, as the Azeris were then called, operetta, about a wealthy guy who can't get married because he's only introduced to women with veils. He doesn't know what they look like. So he goes out into the streets as a peddler, and that way he gets to see girls' faces. A wealthy girl falls in love with him and wants to marry him. Her parents say, "No way you're going to marry a peddler. We have a rich man selected for you." But then it turns out he is, in fact, you see, the wealthy man who is like Haruna Rashid wandering around the street, and it's all very happy, and everyone loves the music. So he says, let's listen to more Arshin Malalan. Yeah? And in fact, he says, everybody in Armenian cities loves this music. Then he lists the Armenian cities. This is a curious thing. I just wanted to mention it. He says, Rostov, Moscow, Petersburg, Tiflis, Yerevan, Alexandropol, cities of the American diaspora, Boston he mentions, and Constantinople. What's missing? All of Western Armenia isn't there. You notice this? He doesn't mention a single Western Armenian city. The years I've been talking about, 1914 to 1917, what happened in between? He doesn't talk about it. This was a subject that somehow, I grant you there was a world war going on in revolution, but there was a strange cognitive disconnect between at least the intelligentsia of Tiflis and Western Armenia. It's very interesting. I mean, there's no way one didn't know refugees were flooding into Yerevan. There was this Gamavorkum, this volunteer legion. The genocide was on the front pages of Western newspapers. Yet in Russian Armenia, very little is said about it. It's a very curious feature. Kara Darvish knew Western Armenian literature well. In particular, he liked Taniel Varuzhan. And out of Varuzhan's poems, he liked most Hetanos Yerkesh, you could expect that, and Harcha, the concubine. Yeah? And he has one poem in which he wrote in Western Armenian, the rest of the poems in Eastern, which is a homage to Taniel Varuzhan. Yet it's a very strange feature, and one I think that we probably have not discussed enough, that is worth discussion, that there was a kind of division between Turkish Armenia and Russian Armenia that predated the division between the diaspora and the Soviet Republic. Like, there were two different cultural worlds. It's very interesting, and it's something I might pursue later on. Kara Darvish was not content merely to write poems in non-traditional forms. Let's go back to one there, that stuff. He altered his vision of, to his vision of future art, also the way he produced and distributed them. He would print them on postcards, which he called Patsiknesh, and sell them in front of the cinema and the opera house in Tiflis. So instead of going to bookstores, instead of binding books, he would sometimes write out his poems, sometimes he would print them on individual little postcards, and try to sell them. The poet's friend Kostan Zaryan describes this spectacle in his book Ansorta Yevir Champan, The Passerby in His Road. I translate. Kara Darvish is selling his poems and postcards outside the doors of a big movie theater. Kara Darvish is a unique phenomenon in our literature, a hero, and in any case a kind of rebel. He's a man standing outside the realm of social prejudice. He has both talent and general education. The Armenian merchant, the fossilized Armenian schoolmaster, the Armenian literati of the Caucasus, slithering from table to table in clubs and salivating, look upon him with scorn and ridicule. But he is the hero. He's the real successor to the dervishes and the ashuks. He preserves the honor of a poet. He is our conscience. Yeah? So. And we have this evocation of the cafe where he used to read, called the Fantasticheski Kabachov, which he helped found, and which lasted about a year. This is the Georgian poet Grigory Robakidze. Tiflis has become a fantastic city, he writes. A fantastic city needed a fantastic corner. And on one fine day at number 12 Rustaveli, which then had another name, it was named after one of the Russian generals, in the courtyard, poets and artists opened a fantastic tavern which consisted of a small room meant for 10 or 15, but which by some miracle had about 50 people in it, more women than men. Phantasmagorias decorated the walls of the room. Virtually every evening, the tavern was open, and poets and artists read their poems and lectures. One of the visitors to the tavern was the famed hostess Vera Sudeikina Stravinskaya, whose family came to Tiflis in 1919, and about whom Osip Mandelstam wrote a poem about his stay in the Crimea. One of his most famous poems, Zolotistova Myoda Struya, Bochka Tikla Taktiguchi, Dolga. Someone, you know, Mandelstam. This is one of his great poems for her. And people wrote in her album, and Mandelstam was one of them. Osip Mandelstam, who wrote Journey to Armenia and Armenian poems and so on, is probably the greatest Russian poet since Pushkin. he was a friend of Kara Darvish's and translated one of his poems into Russian, which I've included in my study. So he was really recognized by the great geniuses of the time, and also by the and also by almost every other Russian poet who passed through. For example, Konstantin Paustovsky was very well known to Soviet readers, maybe not so much in the West. He met one of the futurists named Zdanevich during his stay in Tiflis in '23, and he mentions a book that they had, printed in various typefaces. The title of the book, I'll just say it in Russian, not in English, in order not to offend delicate ears. Цвети поэзия, сукина дочь. It's very rude. It's, yes, it's a...
Please offend me.
Well, okay, I'm about to say something very rude, so basically it would translate nowadays into English as flower, oh poetry, you fucking bitch. Really nasty. But that's what they did. They wanted to offend public taste. And this is what's interesting. It was printed in various typefaces, and Paustovsky remembers, between individual words were inserted various lines, rows of dots, clefs, musical clefs, and letters from Armenian, Georgian, and Arabic, and musical notes. So Kara Darvish had a hand in this, but we don't know too much more about it yet. Yeah. One of the Armenian poets that Kara Darvish knew in Tiflis was Charents. I don't have to introduce him here, do I? I don't think so. The latter wrote poems in the styles of symbolism and decadence in his early years. Then he experimented with futurism, and then he turned to the proletarian verse of the great bard of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Mayakovsky, who, by the way, was born in Georgia, and it's to Mayakovsky that we owe this sketch. Yeah? 1914, Mayakovsky sketched Kara Darvish. Yeah? Anyway, Charents was to disavow futurism later on as he became part of the Soviet Armenian establishment. But he recalls in a letter dated 18 March 1934, that he had gone to meet Vahan Deryan. Vahan Deryan was an Armenian symbolist poet who spent much of his life in St. Petersburg, but was in Tiflis at the time. At another cafe called Chashka Chayu, cup of tea, and he says he saw there Kara Darvish, and then Charents says, "Ein Jamanag in Zanzam Zanov Miak Hai Herinaga." At that time, the only Armenian author whom I knew personally. So he held him in very high regard because Charents usually tended to abuse people much in the same way that Kara Darvish was. Vahan Teryan, for example, for years he criticized. But Kara Darvish seems to have captured his attention. Well, what happened later? In 1921, the communists annexed Georgia. In 1922, the Soviet Union was founded. And Kara Darvish attempted to adapt to the new order somehow, hoping to find a niche of acceptance. It didn't happen. He wrote on literature and theater for the new newspaper Garmir Astr, the Red Star. But in November of 1923, the Armenian House of Culture in Tiflis. Remember that Tiflis then had a great many more Armenians than Yerevan. Yerevan was a small town at the time. Tiflis was the center of Armenian life for the whole Russian Empire. So the Armenian House of Culture held a literary trial, judge and all, of Kara Darvish, who was condemned in a 7-point published verdict, to which he replied. He was unfazed. And who were the judges? 3, a self-appointed triumvirate, consisted of Charents, Kevork Apov, and Azad Vishtuni, all of whom were going to have problems later on in the 30s with the Stalinist regime. But they said futurism had no place in Armenian culture. And fairly soon, it was going to have no place for them either. And so for the 20s, he survived somehow, writing this or that, traveling backwards and forth from Yerevan to Tiflis to secure a pension. And he died in December 1930 and was buried in Gorgiev. His last poem says, again my heart thirsts for its vernal spate of health. Again summers the embrace of the giving body of a girl. Come, come, do not forget that in Apollo's mighty arms great power from the past is yet, and so on. It's a wistful poem looking back to the past. Yeah. So Kara Darvish was the great Armenian futurist, the great innovator, the revolutionary, the daring one, forgotten. His career is testimony, amongst many other things, to the speed at which world culture reached distant Armenia in the days before the internet, and to the astonishing receptivity of a Near Eastern people to innovation when their circumstances permitted, and to the tragedy of the way those innovations were swept aside and forgotten when history was beyond their control. As Nabokov once said in his obituary for Khadasievich, the grief of the loss is too great to speak of, so let us turn instead to the poems. So what I would like to do now is to look at some of Kara Darvish's work. And his literary testament is the poem Oven Yes, Who Am I? In which he says, I'm a crazy-minded dreamer, the stars and the moon are my dream. I'm a solid man of the earth and nature are my roots. I'm a wakeful guardian, the alert observer of all values. I'm a cosmopolitan citizen, the world is my fatherland. I'm a man and man is my comrade and compatriot. I'm a satrap and a tyrant, the executioner of all impostors and Pharisees. I'm a slave, a lamb, a dove, a child, the servant of all the righteous, all the speakers of truth, the doer of their will. I am a fierce and proud Scythian. He uses the word Askanaz here, which means Scythian. I'm the first Armenian who loves the Armenian people as 40,000 brave and manly brothers. I'm a Bolshevik, a Democrat, a socialist, to the tips of the hairs on my head. He also wrote in a line which he later excised that he was a Dashnak too. So for any Tashnaks in the room, that too. Yeah? I'm an anarchist. To everything petrified, I'm death, thunder, and lightning. I'm a maximalist. I break, tear up by the root all that is rotten, old, and stale. I'm a futurist, fiercely proud smasher of idols, the vandal who topples venerable statues from their heavy pedestals and shatters them. I'm a mad lover. I place the stamp of fiery kisses on a lovely woman's bosom, and with wild arms grip her strongly in my stormy and lustful embrace. I'm everything and nothing. I'm Kara Darvish. Right? And then, how are we doing for now? All right. The cup of life, Ganats Pajaga. Let the dead bury the dead. I'm a hero at the wedding feast of life. I'm a deserter from the war waged by barbaric, patriotic bandits. I'm a citizen of the democracy of the spirit. The demonic cackle of ridicule on my quivering lips is for you, you citizens fattened on law and order. And I pass through the dark, cloudy tumult of the avenues of great cities, fully armed with the shield of the spirit. Let the sky thunder. Let fire and lightning flash and crash down on my bare head. Let the naked sword glint over my breast. Let the slippery noose of the gallows loop and tighten at my throat. This is something borrowed by Charents, by the way, from him. There's a poem Charents wrote in 1920 called Mahvan Desil. Vorbes lukvaz tav chutakit zakvaz milardo humesir desa Garodov Miahargu, in this poem, yes? He wrote 2 poems, Mach van der Sil. This is the first one. The next one is in Kirchjana Paris. It's a longer version. But anyway, he took the line from here about the gallows. It's from Kara Darvish. No one's noticed this. They ought to notice it. My body is weak. My spirit is strong, free, bold, soaring over the plains of an untimely death. My spirit's an eagle, strong pinions soaring, coursing high above stupefied skulls. Howl of hatred and scorn. A leap, a mighty leap up the dizzying mountain of skulls. The goblet for a toast to life in my hand. Dedication and song and dance. Demonic wedding. Sing, poet. The world is a graveyard. And let the crystalline tears of repentance stream down and pour from sockets of skulls of stupefied victims. This world is one big peaceful cemetery. It's night. The giant sphere of the moon swims across the sky, its silver layers gleaming down upon me, the mad lover standing over the vast grave of skulls with the cup of life foaming in my hand. This is the monument to the dawning future life. It's the road to new ascents to new heights. Howl and cymbal cast in it, violin, lyre, drum, celebration and feast. Gods, hear my prayer, the melody of my lips. Receive my offering, and from bygone centuries, beneath ruins, raise the golden sunbursts of your heads. I come from the pagan temples. He uses the word Mehayan in Armenian. Nisibis is my fatherland, Midspin. He takes this from Taniel Varusha. So he's referring to ancient Armenia. Sound the trumpets, strike drums, shake the castanets. The bridegroom of life is coming, holding the bride of the new life by her arms. The mad lover comes with the cup of life in his hands. On the road. Yeah, you heard of that before? Yeah. The hero of the new life comes riding his victory chariot, bearing an invitation to the new life. Sound trumpets, blast horns, roses, flowers, laurels, scatter them. Plant them, the conquering hero comes. Sound the trumpets. 1918. Yeah. And he has 800 aphorisms, 800 little proverbs that he composed. And I've chosen just a few. I'll give you an example. People, I want very little from you, just a little bit of freedom. I'm weak because I don't understand you, but I'm strong because you don't understand me. Children are wise, adults are stupid, and those who strive to follow and resemble them are still more stupid. You want happiness for man? Strip him naked and let him loose on the ground. Look at life with the eyes of Adam and let your only property be the fig leaf and you'll be happy. Even the lion lowers his head in front of the sun. Go, don't stand still even if you're about to make a mistake. Real creativity justifies everybody. King, slave, pauper, rich man, martyr, criminal, talented, dullard, everybody. Write in such a way that your every line is worth a chunk of your life. If even a drop of ink remain at the tip of your pen, don't let it dry up. Write, so that the reader may bless and remember you. Stay awake, and then the life around you will not sleep either. Then I have his Manifesto, which goes on for a bit. I want to get to some of the poems. Yes, here we go. And these are the strange futurist poems I alluded to earlier. Incantations. It's very hard to translate something that it is not supposed to make rational sense even in the original, but I've tried. You petty demon. Let's go back to the text. Oh, sorry. What I want to do, there's something I forgot to mention. This novel, published in Boston during World War II, Novel Erandra, is one of the great prose works in Armenian that nobody reads because it's very thick. But chapter 9 is all about Kara Darvish and his friends, so it's come out with my study. It's a strange novel. Has anyone here actually read it? Right. Yeah, it's about this Armenian sea captain from from Batum in Georgia, named Herian, who at the birth of the Armenian Republic, decides what he wants to do is to take a ship, convey it by train to Armenia, and let it loose on Lake Sevan. This will make people happier. And so he tries to do this, and runs into all sorts of problems. He has many meditations, and he meets friends, including Kara Darvish and all of his friends in Tiflis. But here you see the ship being lifted. This is just a fantastic example of the kind of Armenian graphic art that used to exist. Yeah, it's very much the style of Hagop Kojayan. Yeah? And it's from Boston. So, you know, we had a cultural life there, which was quite something once upon a time. It was astonishing. And I wanted to show you that. Anyway, that's something to look forward to, but we go back. Yeah. Tu devu pokrik, zaran zarvurik, du chikchik muti, faranar turik, karanzav chekvats neri, muti mechen far, nevagumes, nunufar, tu churinch anvi, tu hunchun srinki, aranzar menerki, yerpar, garankar, zenet marabgar. Horom, morom, lar, bialar, garumar, and then it gets more esoteric. But basically it's something like this. You petty demon, Zaranzar errant, little bat of the dark, Faranar at the door, defile of crevasses and far from the dark's mist, you are playing water lily, you are the squeak of the wheel, the trill of the flute, Aranzar of a solo song, song, dance, Zarangar, your voice, Marapkar. Marapkar, Mar means either a saint or the abbot of a monastery in Syriac, and Apkar, you know, is an Armenian and Syrian name. Rome, morom, string, single note, note of spring. And then he goes on. Zum, non, zin, zin, un, zin, zin, zan, zin, zan, 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 zin, zin, zan. Well, why? This is why. What's the word for a symbol? Tzuntzcha. Tzuntzcha. Yeah, it comes from an old Syriac word, tzilzila. Charents, especially Charents, but many poets, like Vahan Deryan before him, loved the sound za. And they loved to experiment with various words that created alliterative patterns with za, because they saw the golden leaves of autumn as symbols clashing, and so they would make word experiments with these. But usually these word experiments concern words that actually existed. Kara Darvish goes ahead and he creates his own patterns of non-existent words. And then he goes, Orom, orom, poo-poo, poo-poo, ayornimu, churmijar, sarm, zagarmihars, ipars. And then chachreri chachr, sword into soaring. Perner seized I kachr, lever ilur, herded into news. Maderi pur, entered the furnace. Zar par bizar, furteri farfer. It all sort of sounds almost Armenian, but it's not. And then there are bits that are. Iharb zakar. Harb, again, is classical, meaning through the father, by means of father. Hayr. Zakar is a name. Zurtan zatar. And then Shresh Blur. The poem Shresh Blur is interesting. Shresh Blur is a place near Echmiadzin. It was excavated by Yervan Lalayan just before the beginning of World War I. It's a largely artificial hill. It's mentioned by Moses Khorenatzi, who is a source also for Kara Darvish's work on Armenian mythology. And it yielded antiquities going back to the Bronze Age. Now, just as the Russian futurists were interested in the earliest strata of human culture because those were the most innocent and pure and natural, so this is what fascinated Kara Darvish too. So he called his poem Shresh Blur. Again, what he's doing is taking local Armenian material, yes, but applying the ideas of futurism to it. So that's why it has this name. Plus, it's also just a nice name, Shresh, for asphodel. It's an Iranian word. It probably comes from a word meaning blue. because you can make glue out of asphodel flowers. Sarish, sarish, yeah. And it's also loaned into Arabic. The Arabic word for an asphodel is asrish, I think. So the dance of the dervishes. Karabalach, karabalach, zan, blan, dublach, dublach. He called out again and again from the darkness of the east. Now, dublach, dublach. Sounds like it means something. And Kara Darvish writes specifically, he says, this word that I invented, dublach, will not be found in any dictionary, but everybody from Mongolia to the Aegean will think it means something because somehow in their souls it has a meaning. So Mongols, Tatars, Armenians will all think my word dublach means something. I have done my best, it doesn't mean anything. But nonetheless, it sounds like it ought to. Yeah? So, I want to conclude by coming around to some slightly more familiar territory. A writer named William Saroyan wrote a series of letters to the dead from Paris when he was an old man. Many of them were eccentrics, men whose particular character or genius set them apart, left them alone, and sometimes led to a tragic death. One of them was Professor Kalfayan, a composer who had lived in Paris, who dressed like a dandy, and was adrift and eventually went insane in Fresno. Or there was Dr. Anushavan Champ, the publisher of Armenian weeklies in Sofia, Bucharest, Cairo, and Paris. Also a very flamboyant dresser, but nobody in the cafes of Fresno ever bought a single copy of his satirical newspaper, Tzachavel, the Broom, and he vanished too. In 1935, Saroyan visited the USSR with a delegation of American writers that included Edmund Wilson and many of the other cultural leaders of the time. There he met the poet Charentz, who had experimented, as we've seen, with every avant-garde movement that had swept through the dying Russian Empire and the young USSR, a consummate editor and scholar and one-time friend of Kara Darvish, who was now a morphine addict, who was gradually being excluded from the party, from the literary establishment. And Charentz was in disfavor. He was to die 2 years later. Charentz met Saroyan and told him that when dealing with the authorities, the custodians of propriety and convention, in the arts, in literature, wherever, to say yes and then spit in their eye. Saroyan wrote from his Paris apartment to the dead poet. Why didn't you say yes? I'll tell you why, Charentz. Because you are more than an Armenian. More than only another member of the human race. You are a poet, so shocked by the treachery of all men, seeking to save their skins at any cost, that only with the help of cocaine could you stay among them and pretend to be one of them. God loved them, as every poet is obliged to say, not with contempt, but with charity. They all did, they're all doing, only what you advised me to do, which I have never done, which you never did. So long live Armenian poetry. Amen, and thank you very much.